Welcome to the Revelation File. I'm Wally Wood, your host. Thank you for joining us again for this broadcast. The last time we were with you, we talked about what I called the mystery of Daniel 12. And we began that in Matthew 24, Jesus in his prophetic discourse. And he made a comment that I want to bring to your attention again because we're going to continue this phase 2, this part 2 of what we started last week on the mystery in Daniel 12. Um, over here in Matthew 24, we find in verse 15, Jesus is speaking and he says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who be in Judea flee to the mountains." And then he said a number of things after that. But our attention is given to this fact that he refers you to another book and another chapter in describing what he's about to detail himself. And he's pretty much, his comments are running parallel to the 12th chapter of Daniel. And if you recall, last time we took you into Daniel 11 and Daniel 12 to focus in on what Jesus is referring to in these last days, the setting up of the abomination of desolation. And I'm not going to go through the details of what we did last time. You can go back and review that. But I called it the pre-rapture rapture. That in Daniel chapter 12, we find that there is a resurrection that takes place. And in that resurrection, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. And we reviewed the fact that what we know about the rapture of the church, according to the writings of Paul, that when that last trumpet blows, then we which are alive in Christ will not precede those who have already passed on. They will rise first, then we will be caught up with them in the air, in the presence of the Lord, and there we will be with him from that day forward. But it's called the first resurrection, and that's of all the righteous themselves. None of the unrighteous are part of that rapture, that resurrection, that first resurrection. But in Daniel chapter 12, we have a mix. This is a resurrection that takes place involving some righteous and some unrighteous, some saved and some unsaved. And we established the fact that through other scriptures that we brought in, that this was of those who lived at the time that Jesus walked on this earth. We even showed you in Revelation 1:7 that upon his return, every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And that's a revelation. No pun intended, but that is a revelation. It's outside the lines of what we've been theologically taught about the rapture of the church. So this is a pre-rapture rapture of those who lived at the time that Jesus was here. And I've likened it to a front row seat before the rapture of the church. It's God's last final "I told you so." And Jesus told Caiaphas, "You're going to see me coming in the clouds." So that was last time. But I want to move forward now into another element of mystery, if you will, that has stymied a lot of prophecy teachers and people who read, and see if I can shed some new light on this one additional mystery that Daniel speaks about, because Jesus picks it up from this point and goes forward in Matthew 24. So in Daniel chapter 12, starting in verse 8. "As for me," Daniel says, "I heard, but I couldn't understand. So I said, 'My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events?'" Verse 9. And he says, "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time." So the prophetic words in Daniel chapter 12 are sealed until the last days. Verse 10, "Many will be purged, purified, and refined. But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. but those who have insight, they will understand. Now I'm reading out of the New American Standard. Verse 11. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. Verse 13. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335th day. Let's look closely at these last two verses. Daniel says that from the time that the daily sacrifice is brought to an end. Now, when will that occur? We're told elsewhere in Daniel that it would occur in what's called the midst of the week. He speaks of a 7-year period, and in the midst of that week, which is 3.5 years into that week of 7 days, 7 years, the daily sacrifice will be brought to an end. Then he goes on to say, from that moment, when the daily sacrifice is brought to an end, to the time that the abomination of desolation is set up, see, this is what Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, let him that reads, let him understand. So at that moment, from the time the daily sacrifice is brought to an end, which is in the midst of the tribulation period, to the time that the abomination of desolation is set up, what does that mean? He's standing in the holy place. He's establishing himself as deity in the holy place of the temple. There shall be a span of time. And what is that span of time? He says it right here, 1290 days. But if you do the math, and that's the second half of the midst of the week that's referring to here, that's the final 3.5 years. So you add that half to the first half, you got the full 7-year period. All right? You following me? The abomination of desolation, the Antichrist, establishes himself as God on the 1290th day from the end of the sacrifice. What happens at that point? Well, let's go back to Matthew 24, in which he says in verse 21, then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever shall. Day 1290, after the end of the sacrifice, when the abomination of desolation is set up, according to what Jesus said in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. So we know what's going to happen on that 1290th day after the end of the sacrifice. It completes the 7-year cycle of the period of time that Daniel was speaking about. At that moment, he's staying in the holy place. Jesus says, then will come great tribulation, such as has not existed since the world began. So the great tribulation that everybody's been talking about starts at the end of the 7-year period, not in the middle. I know this is going to bring some flack, but I'm just reading to you what the scriptures are saying and connecting it in accordance to the timing that Jesus and Daniel are referring to. The Great Tribulation starts on the day that the Antichrist stands in the holy place, declaring himself to be God. But look at Daniel once again. He continues. Verse 12. Blessed is he who waits and attains to the 1335 days. Do the math. 1335 minus 1290 is 45 days. What does that mean? Go back to Jesus. For then shall be great tribulation. In the New American Standard, it says a great tribulation, signifying that it's a short period of time. In fact, Jesus says that even further in verse 22, Matthew 24. And unless those days be cut short, no flesh will be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. How short? 45 days. The Great Tribulation is only 45 days long, not 3.5 years. According to what the pattern, the formula, the timeline that we're reading right here, between Matthew 24, verse 15, Daniel 12, verses 11 through 12. Just let that sink in for a minute. I'm not on a campaign to make Wallywood great. I'm not on some ego trip, as some have accused me of being, of trying to build for myself a select following. I'm here because the Lord opened a door and He made a way. And He told me to bring before this audience, wherever you happen to be, the things that He has opened to me in the Word for many, many years. And I'll leave that with you and your own concept of what is a holy ministry. But my ministry has been on the end times, world events, biblical prophecies. And this prophecy tells me, according to the numbers that have been put forth, knowing that the daily sacrifice is brought to an end in the middle of the week of 7 years. And from that moment, 1290 days, is when the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist himself, sits in the holy place, declaring himself to be God. And you can read about it in 2 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about how he will exalt himself above all gods and every god, declaring himself to be God. And we won't go into that at this particular moment. But I want to establish this knowledge line with my viewers. Jesus said, no man knows the hour, the day or the hour, not even the Son of Man or the angels, only God himself. And yet we have this. Now, it was to be hidden until that time. So there was something in here for us to know. As you've heard me say this before, the more you know, the less you fear. Because the more you know of what God has said in His Word and established as truth, then nothing catches you off guard. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither be dismayed. We are not shaken by the things that we're expecting. And this is the overturning of and the revealing of the things that God said would be a secret until that time. The Great Tribulation, only 45 days long. Now, Daniel says, blessed is he who endures. Some versions say who waits until the 1335th day. What kind of blessing are we talking about? Folks, I'm sorry. I get so caught up in just the awesomeness of Revelation. My words may fumble and may not be pristine, but the revelation of revelation, the revelation of insight, just thrills me to the core. I want to give you a sense of the timing of this to add some further biblical support to this. Revelation 13, you've heard me talk about it before, the most high-tech chapter in all the Bible, gives you the details of the reign of the Antichrist. I make note of the fact that we've been told in Revelation 13 that he receives a wound to the head, a fatal wound. It's a wound that kills him. And in the course of events that follow, he's raised from the dead. And again, there are some details I can share on that, and that's for another time. But suffice it to say, he's raised from the dead. Now, we know he's to become blasphemous. Paul admitted to that as well in 2 Thessalonians, that blasphemy will come out of his mouth, declaring himself to be God, untouchable, unstoppable. But I also note the fact that it's only after his resurrection that those blasphemies begin, not before. Before, he's driven by flatteries. And Daniel tells you that in the 11th chapter of his book, that he flatters and he is flattered. But after his resurrection, blasphemies take place and take over. And this is where I want to focus our attention in wrapping this up. In Revelation 13, we're introduced to the image of the beast. And it's my contention that because of the assassination, perhaps, the wound to the head that was fatal, that precautions are taken to prevent this from happening to him again. And so therefore, there is the need for what's known as the image of the beast. We're told in Scripture, especially in Revelation 13, that the world worships the beast. We're told that twice. They worship the beast. But then when the image of the beast comes to play, things change a bit. We're told that, of course, the Antichrist makes war against the saints and overcomes them. Daniel says that he wears down the saints. Here in verse 15 of Revelation 13, we read where the false prophet gives rise to this image of the beast, that it should speak, and that it would cause all who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now, how does that happen? In a world of 7.5 plus billion people, how is he going to know who's worshiping him and who's not? Well, one of the ways he's going to know is that if you carry a cell phone or something electronic on your person, your whereabouts are known. And this goes back to the world of transparency, which we've talked about before, and we can talk about it again soon. In a world that's gone totally transparent digitally, they will know where you are at any given time. And when the call goes out to pause to worship the beast, anyone who is not on the exempt file will be located, identified, and taken out. He will cause anyone who does not worship the image of the beast to be killed. People don't change their gods that quickly. On one hand, they're worshiping the beast. Now they're worshiping the image of the beast. How? The image must be an image. It must look like, sound like, walk like, talk like, act like the original, and still be an image. And everyone will throw their worship toward the image. Now, it's in this context that the image of the beast puts forth the command to receive a mark in your right hand or in your forehead, without which you cannot buy or sell. I want you to follow me on something like this. That's in chapter 13. In chapter 14 of Revelation, we read that there's a warning that goes out to those who receive the mark. And it is to those who have received the mark of the beast in their flesh that this warning goes out. In chapter 15 of Revelation, we read of the preparation of the vials of the wrath of God to be poured out upon those who have received the mark. All right? And then in chapter 16, we have the outpouring of those vials of God's wrath upon those who receive the mark. Chapter 16, verse 2. And the first angel went and poured out his bowl unto the earth, and it became a loathsome and malignant sore upon the men who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. So the outpouring of God's wrath is upon those who have received the mark. Now the question has always arisen, where is the rapture of the church in all this? The presumption has always been that the rapture would come before the tribulation began. And that's the predominant view. Now, to make that work, it's somewhere early after the beginning of the daily sacrifice, because the daily sacrifice marks the beginning of the 7-year period, as we've just discussed. Okay? Now, Jesus said that at the end of the tribulation period, then shall be great tribulation, the likes of which has never been before. And unless those days be cut short, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days would be cut short. I maintain that the nation of Israel has never been called the elect. They've not been called the saints. They've been called other things, but they've never been called the bride or the elect or the saints. So, but for the elect's sake, those days would be cut short. Okay? Now, follow me with this if you will. Revelation 13 is the issuance of the mark. Chapter 14 is a warning against those who've received the mark. Chapter 15 is the preparation of the vials of God's wrath to be poured out upon those who have the mark. Chapter 16 is the outpouring of those vials upon those who have received the mark. Blessed is he who waits until the 1335th day. At the end of that 45-day great tribulation, what awaits those who have endured, those who wait until that time? Well, let me point you to chapter 14 of Revelation. And in here, we read of the fact that in verse 6, and be sure that I've got the right verse here. Verse 9. Another angel, a third one, followed, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worship the image, the beast and his image, and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. Here is the verse 12. Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. Verse 14 of chapter 14. And I looked and beheld a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like unto the Son of Man, and having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And the angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, For put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Brethren, that's the picture of the rapture. The one sitting on a white cloud. I don't need to explain that to you. Jesus said that upon his appearance in the cloud, he'll send forth his angels and reap the earth of every nation, of those who are his. The language is parallel. This is where the rapture occurs, after the issuance of the mark, before the preparation of the vials, and before the outpouring of those vials. It occurs in chapter 14 of the book of Revelation. And there's a continuity. I showed it to you. The mark is issued in 13, and then the continuity continues until chapter 16. And in the middle of that comes the reaping, the rapture. Blessed is he who waits and attains to the 1335th day. We could go deeper into this. We're running out of time now, but I wanted to lay that before you and encourage you to do your own study. I'm not anybody's expert, but this is where I've spent all my life, is studying these scriptures. The mystery of Daniel, part 2, is in these days following the end of the sacrifice and the reaping of the earth. I'm Wally Wood. I thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your patience and your trust, and I look forward to seeing you again.
You have been watching the Revelation File Report with Wally Wood, a Wally Wood Ministries production from Houston, Texas. You are able to support the ministry by donating at wallywoodministries.com and by mail at Wally Wood Ministries, P.O. Box 42005, Houston, Texas 77242. Wally is available to present full 2-hour forums in your city called the Revelation File News Forum. For more details, contact Andy Valadez at 713-560-3348 or by email at andy@andyvaladez.com. The Revelation File News Report is a weekly update of global trends in the news as it aligns with end-time Bible prophecy. Tune in again next time, and be sure to like and share this channel.